This is Duke University.
Hello, it's so great to be here. Thank you to Laurent and Jennifer for inviting me. Early in my graduate school career, I had the privilege of attending a similar symposium on the common wind at the University of Michigan, and it was totally world-changing. And Julius Scott's work has been world-changing for so many of us. After it was published in 2018, Vince Brown noted, "The Common Wind, quote, was a work so exciting, original, and profound that young history graduate students used to pass it around like an underground mixtape, inspiring an entire generation to create a new field of knowledge about the past. Today we get to talk with some of that generation and to think about the past and ongoing centrality of the common wind to the field of Atlantic history."
I first met Dr. Scott in the 80s. He was my first history professor. Dr. Scott, history professor. I emphasize those words now because that's how they mattered to me then. And they mattered to me then in that way because Dr. Scott was also black. He was my first history professor, and he was also my first black professor. And those things mattered to me in college because Rice was the whitest place I had ever been since I started paying attention to things like that. But in Dr. Scott's class, Rice was a more comfortable place. There were a clutch of black students, there was Dr. Scott himself, and then there was the subject matter, the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. By more comfortable, I do not mean that the class offered a respite from what I then perceived to be the special madness of my first year in college. More reading, more writing, and more demands on what it meant to read and to write than I had ever been subject to. Dr. Scott's civil rights class had all of that and more, and more. By more comfortable, I mean that the course offered a kind of belonging, a kind of esprit de corps. This work is too hard for me. This reading is too much for me. This professor is demanding a grasp of the book and a clarity of thought that rather hurts. But I am going to do this. One of the reasons I was going to do it is because Julius's course gave me my first measure of what I would later learn was intellectual excitement. My goodness. The things we read. Stride toward freedom. I'm reading Martin Luther King Jr. I knew I could listen to Dr. King, but I can read him as well. Alice Walker's Meridian. What? We get to read fiction in a history class? My soul is rested. High drama. Look out, Whitey. Black power's gonna get your mama. There are books with titles like these. Civilities and Civil Rights. So this is history? This guy seems like he was there. And Scott was brilliant and human. I'm certain that he was nervous the first day. I was nervous the entire first year. So I appreciated that. But this guy also clearly had the keys to the kingdom. He talked about the author of Civilities and Civil Rights like he knew him. And he said things along the order of this. We are reading this book, but we probably also need to read that book too. And I found this kind of agenda setting powerful and exciting. Yes, we were in a class, but the beginning and the end of this class was really just a beginning. I first saw the Common Wind that semester too, in his office, on a sparse black bookshelf. For a book, it was rather strangely bound. No pictures on the cover. And it had Dr. Scott's name lettered on it. And I remember asking him, "You wrote that? Yourself?" And then he proceeded to tell me some things about the history of the world, some things of which I had almost no grasp, except that I thought that there might now be another way to look at Inashanki Shange's for colored girls. Most of what he told me went over maroons, revolutions. I didn't know anything about black people. Dr. Scott was gone the next year, and I met him again about 4 years later in graduate school. And between the reading courses that Dr. Scott did for us, his fantastic seminar on the origins of Afro-America, the things he said when we bumped into each other on campus, and my finally reading the book that I had seen in his office all those years before, with all of that, Scott proffered a vision of the African diaspora that was intellectually critical and personally empowering. In The Common Wind and in his teaching and mentoring, Scott provided a transformative view that centered black life and politics and black know-how and black tragedy, and it centered those things at different focal lengths in local, regional, and world history that were all endlessly stimulating and important. Before I came to appreciate Scott's work, I had a static view of the diaspora. I got diaspora. I had read Equiano's narrative, though most of it was wasted on me. I had been enthralled by the dynamic relationship between Barbados and South Carolina and the prospect of African technological contributions to colonial economies, and by the very phrase, black majority. But I had a rather point-to-point view on the black world, which meant that my perspective on black life in the Western Hemisphere was severely occluded. It was hardly hemispheric at all. And I remember, too, when much of this changed for me, sitting in the reading room of the Duke Archives with the university's copy of The Common Wind and following Scott's argument about the growing importance of urban areas in defining and shaping the nature of Afro-American life in the late 18th century. It's on page 14 and 15 of the book. I won't read the whole quote, I'll just read the last sentence. By the 1790s, larger cities like Kingston, Cap Francais, and Havana could properly be termed capitals of Afro-America. And dissidents in dozens of smaller coastal cities were engaging in the kinds of transactions that would play a crucial role in spreading the excitement of the age of revolutions in the Caribbean. It was that phrase, capitals of Afro-America, that did it for me. This metaphor tapped into my limited, probably overly nationalistic sense of black life in the hemisphere, and it helped me to begin to see the space in a fuller breadth. It connected for me places and ideas that had tumbled about in my mind in a rather disconnected fashion heretofore. Scott powerfully pointed out a geography of Western life, Western black life, and he populated it in ways that demonstrated its genuineness. It was real. And he analyzed it in ways that underlined the perils of neglecting it. I was persuaded by Scott more powerfully than I had been persuaded before. Perhaps I should say armed by Scott more powerfully than I had been armed before. That you needed a grasp of the American Revolution to grasp black life in the hemisphere. And you needed a grasp of black life in the hemisphere if you wanted to fully grasp the revolution. And you couldn't grasp the revolution if you did not also have a handle on the revolt in Saint-Domingue. And perhaps you did not have much of a handle on the revolt in Saint-Domingue if you did not recognize, etc., etc., etc. Even more so, if you did not know what could be seen on a clear day from where, and you lacked an appreciation of the winds and currents in various microenvironments between Virginia and Venezuela, well, maybe you should know those things. You scholar of migration in the Americas. Maybe you should appreciate those things. You student of the American Revolution. I found all this terribly important, but I also found it terribly satisfying because of the lamentations that arose from within and without the profession in the 1980s and beyond concerning the problems with taking African American history seriously. conservatives and liberals and former liberals all warned of the bad consequences of centering the Black experience. I don't think that it's going too far to say that reasonable people feared that such work endangered the Republic. I had certainly put down the disuniting of America, feeling rather like a problem. As an undergraduate, such criticism gave me pause. But when I finally came to understand what Scott had been trying to teach me, I realized that there was a great deal indeed that these critics who feared for the Republic could stand to learn about the Republic.
Hello, everyone. One thing Dr. Scott taught us all how to do is how to speak and tell what we know. And try to tie that into things that you thought you knew, but maybe you didn't know as well. And then there's some links that they seem to be out there, but you bring those back together and suddenly a whole new world opens up. And he would spend hours doing that, trying to help you make those connections. He never gave you the connection. He would sit there and he'd work with you all through that. My first couple years at Duke were spent in his office, in an armchair, cuddled up with whatever book he had given me to answer the little question that I thought was simple. And he would say, oh, okay, well, why don't you read this? I'd read that, and I'd say, okay, I think the answer is, he's like, well, you're on the right track. And then he'd go back to his bookshelf, and he'd pull another book down, and he'd hand that to me, and I'd read that. And I'd say, okay, so really what the answer is, he'd say, no, okay. So he'd go back, and he'd pull another book down, and he'd give that to me, and so I spent a lot of time sitting in that chair trying to figure out what it was exactly that he wanted me to figure out about this. In the meantime, I'm sitting in that chair, and he never pushed me out when somebody else would come in the room. So Jennifer would come in, she'd have a question about something she was writing. Herman would come in the room, and he'd have a question about something he was trying to figure out. And I would be pulled into this conversation as well. It became a community engagement, a community of scholars. And we were all working on this project of redefining history. He helped me understand what I wanted to do. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no idea. And I thought I had a simple answer for the questions that I was asking. And again, he would say, well, that's cute. Yeah. But you might want to dive a little deeper into that and think about it in this way. The question that I had, that I was working on, was looking at people of color who were free during the time of enslavement. And there were answers out there. There were scholars who were working on that and had worked on that, and there was literature out there. But he helped me problematize those questions and the answers that were there, to think about who is writing those answers, and to realize that I had a story to tell and a way to tell it that hadn't been done before. And that was just as logical, just as rational, just as needed as what was out there. And again, he would go up to his bookshelf and he'd pull something down and he'd say, okay, look at this. See how that was done? How would you answer that question? How would you do that? What do you see that's missing in this project? And how would you go about putting that, inserting that into it? it was really important because I had a single narrative. I had a single way of thinking of things, and Dr. Scott was like, no, that's not the way we're going to be doing history anymore. And you are going to be part of that. I'm going to make sure you do that. All the time being very humble about it. I don't think he really understood what he was doing and how he was doing it, but it happened. And those of us here are the product of that love and introspection. It turned out that I had thought that if I was going to write about these free people of color, it had to be antebellum U.S. stuff. So he pulls out Common Wind and says, well, yeah, you could, but there's a whole lot more questions out there that haven't been answered yet, and you could do that. You speak another language, you can go and figure that out from that other language point of view, from that other cultural point of view, and give us some more on this. So it took me a while, but I did, and I finally got something out about this free community of color in Puerto Rico and how they conceptualize themselves and helped build a nation and all of these things. But it all goes back to that armchair in Dr. Scott's office. If I hadn't had that, I don't know if I would be standing here today talking to you about all of this. I was really fortunate to be here at Duke with a cohort of students who were exploring all of these things, and to be here at a time when Dr. Scott was here helping us ask those questions. And we have changed the world. The scholarship that is out there. The paradigm has shifted. And it's because of the common wind. We are that wind.
Good afternoon. It really is an honor to be here, and partly because of all the generations in this room. And people I have known for 30 years. And Alex and I lived in the same building, and I was saying yesterday how when the money ran out at the end of the month, we'd be like, and Jeanette would make us some Kool-Aid. So anyway, sorry, TMI. Okay, so and it was an incredible time, and you know, as Kathryn said, the cohort, and I think we take for granted, I think, just how much that meant to us then and certainly now. So it is great to be part of this occasion. I'd like to just briefly recognize the traditional indigenous people of this territory as we come together here. Certainly there are many, including the Catawba and the Shakori. Unlike some of the other panelists here, I am an interloper of sorts, as I did not work with Professor Scott on my dissertation. The pleasure of working with Professor Wood and many others, and glad that he is here as well. And so I represent the thousands upon thousands profoundly influenced by Professor Scott, even without this special connection. Although not on my dissertation committee, I was in Professor Scott's class, already mentioned, Origins of Afro-America, in the fall of 1991. While at Duke, I was mostly intimidated by Professor Scott and admired him from afar. Faith Smith, who's not here, and I used to talk about just the voice, and just that in and of itself, I just was like, be very afraid. So anyhow,
voices.
So still, whenever we interacted, he always asked how my work was progressing and posed questions about my life stretching beyond academia. More on that in a moment. I do not recall who loaned me their photocopy of The Common Wind. I do remember, though, I had to return it. It was told to me that it was a loan and only a loan. As others will concur, reading The Common Wind transformed how I understood the African diaspora, the masterless Caribbean, and more so, how I perceived and conceived of it, how I navigated its contours and its boundaries. From the very beginning, I was struck by who showed up in this book. Having been born and raised in Jamaica for much of my childhood, I was positively astounded when I read his description in the first few pages in chapter 1, it's on page 27, of women higglers in Jamaica. Quote, as the broker in the lively commerce between country and city, end quote. My response to this was basically, what? A big-time professor like you will write about higglers? Like, give them a shout out? Like, what is this? So, I was quite floored, to say the least, by the way he talked about the significance of these women. This seemingly small inclusion was monumental to me. It also reinforced what I had begun to consider and reconsider in my undergraduate years about who was foregrounded, who was marginalized, even silenced, and for what purposes. In the narratives we conjure up about Black history, the African diaspora, who are the individuals often hidden away and deemed not valuable enough, not important enough, not enough, full stop. Higglers were, of course, only the beginning. In this book, Scott integrates musicians, seamen, traders, vagrants, militiamen, and all manner of masterless people in inter-island processes of the organic, purposeful movement of people, of news, of ideas, of goods, of rituals, of resistance, of the grapevine and the deep subterranean roots of the common wind. As if that were not enough, where does this book not take you? The book brings to life the generative, capacious exchanges of ideas and narratives between Cuba, Jamaica, and Saint Domingue, a different kind of triangular trade and mobility that I had never imagined between these three spaces, as well as Puerto Rico, Guadeloupe, Martinique, Venezuela, Argentina, St. Kitts, Curacao, Trinidad, Dominica, Grenada, the Danish islands, further north into New Orleans, Maryland, Philadelphia. These are only a few that make an appearance in this text. It is, of course, not only about the fact that he nimbly teases out and contextualizes shards of information from myriad multilingual archival sources. This was and still remains a Herculean feat, but also how he weaves these stories together in ways that provide some sense of the fullness of the Black and brown women and men in these stories, of their transgressions, longings, and risks, and the ripples, waves, and full-blown hurricanes emanating from the common wind of these networks of communication. Although important to take some time to include the book in my brief comments, I wanted to at least take a moment to highlight how Professor Scott informed one element of my own understanding of my place as an academic in the classroom and beyond. He is, of course, an incredible teacher and someone who has honed the art and the gift of engaging with students like us in a way that encouraged us to think deeply, individually on our own, and as Kathryn mentioned, collectively too, as graduate students, grappling with myriad notions. Notions sometimes conflicting and contradictory as we made our way along the journey of an idea. In seminars, he was interested in our analyses and interpretations. I imagine now how they must have appeared quite simplistic, and yet he always quietly angled his head, nodded, and gestured for more as he questioned us, as if what we expressed was worthy of this kind of interrogation in the first place. Then and now, one of the gifts I appreciate and attempt to pass on to my own students is simply to allow the academic world to be just one part of your world. As the years and decades have passed, I have come to appreciate more and more the importance of living beyond the academic bubble, sometimes with velvet chains, and recognizing the liberatory nature of abiding within and without it. Over the years, through the Duke grapevine, people shared news of him, what was happening or what they understood was happening to him. Most recently, of course, news traveled about the book finally being published with some resistance from Professor Scott. Last year, at the AHA's gathering in his honor in Chicago, in his comments, I was reminded again about the significance of perspective from within academia as well as distance from it, of the importance of plans as well as the countless ways the currents and rhythms of our lives move us in different directions than we may have expected. So thank you, Professor Scott, for sharing that sense of life beyond academia with me long ago, and then the gentle reminder last year about the common wind of movement, of change, of liberation in our work and in our lives. I shall always remain in deep gratitude and appreciation for your willingness to extend your gifts to me and to all of us. Thank you.
It's hard to follow that. It's hard to follow all of my colleagues, my cohort, my brothers and sisters who have learned so much from Julius Scott. I want to first acknowledge all of you for coming. Thank you. I recognize the importance of this moment. I want to thank the people who organized this, especially Jennifer Morgan, especially Jackie Looney, who brought us all together so many years ago, especially Professor Scott for doing that work, writing that book, and teaching us all in the way he taught us. But I'm also here to apologize. Because I wasn't really a very good graduate student when I was here, and you worked on me. You didn't let me go, and I very much appreciate that. When I first came, I remember I came as a prospective graduate student, just checking out graduate school, and I stayed with Herman Bennett and Jennifer Morgan, who hosted me. And I went to some of the early parties, and I remember people would talk about, they would ask me a question and say, "What kind of history do you do?" I was like, "Do history?" Does one do? I thought I came to learn history because I thought I was kind of coming to do a second undergraduate degree in history. I didn't know I was coming to do history. I thought I was just coming to learn something. And over the course of time, and partly, especially because of Julius Scott's tutelage and others, I learned to do history. And I want to talk a little bit about what that meant. Laurent Dubois said that something amazing happened here. And I want to emphasize that. There was something amazing happening here in the early to mid-90s, brought about in part because Jacqueline Looney brought together several cohorts of scholars who were interested in history from below, in African American history, interested in connections between histories that had been kept apart, and brought us together with scholars who were doing that kind of forward-thinking work. And at the center of that work was Julius Scott's dissertation, The Common Wind. In the last session with graduate students, Julius called out his mentor, Peter Wood. And I would like to also acknowledge Peter Wood because I read Peter Wood's Black Majority as an undergraduate. And what I took from that most powerfully and really most simply is that enslaved Black people were not ciphers. They were not merely extensions of their master's will. They knew things. That it was in fact their very basic and fundamental humanity that was enslaved. And he passed that on to his student Julius Scott, who took that and said there are people who knew things in a broad geographic area. He stretched that out, so we were no longer just talking about relations between masters and slaves. We were no longer talking about plantations or individual colonies, but we were talking about the geopolitics of slavery. Imagine enslaved Black people being at the center of a world transformative geopolitical story. totally reshaped the geography of my imagination and what history could be. So a lot of people talk about how hard it was to get Julius Scott's dissertation out of the library. And that was because, as Professor Gaffield mentioned, and I've said many times, we were all passing it around like an underground mixtape. Right? It was a historiographical deep cut that we all needed to hear. It was like, if you were a dancer and you wanted to learn a new dance move from your friends, it's like you got to go get with the guy who knows the move. Right? For those of us who can't dance, it was like, for Black history geeks, this was the dance move that we were all trying to pick up. And it was, how does one write history on that broad canvas? Thinking about those networks of information that Black people were at the very center of, that Black people passed along because they knew things, because they were actively engaged in their world. And if that dissertation was prescient, too early for its time, to get published as a book right away, it was in part because not only historians, but academics in general were moving from a perspective analysis in which they were thinking about social anatomy, how to break down the elements of a thing and figure out what that thing is, what constitutes that thing, to thinking about network analysis. And this is not only in history and the humanities and social sciences, this is in the sciences too. Network analysis was still relatively fairly new to a lot of people. And moving from social anatomy to network analysis was an incredibly powerful gesture. Totally, sorry, trying to stay on time. Totally reshaped our frameworks. So when Alex Byrd talks about that phrase, the capitals of Afro-America, these were nodes in a network that we had previously been unable to imagine. And Professor Scott's work helped us to imagine that. The last thing I want to say is about the cohort of people who I came in with. I happened to come in a kind of particularly magical time. And this is one of the things that makes that moment so amazing, where we had, I think, 7 or 8 African American scholars come in 1992, and another 7 or 8 come in 1993, working with a cluster of faculty interested in social history. So we had William Chafe and Raymond Gavins and Lawrence Goodwin and John J. Topaski in Latin America working on social history, right? We had David Barry Gaspar and Peter Wood and Julius Scott doing the history of slavery, but the social history of slavery, thinking about these histories from below. And so in that, that network, we began to think about a long transnational Black freedom struggle that extended from the earliest moments of the slave trade through the civil rights movement, and that encompassed the entire Atlantic world. It was only by being embedded in those conversations that included people like Hassan Jeffries working on the Black Power movement, and people like Alex Byrd working on migration in the 18th century, that I think we got to where we have come today, where we've truly been able to change the way one thinks about historiography. I still think that I could have benefited by learning even more from my peers. As I said, I wasn't the best graduate student. My advisor, David Barry Gaspar, once told me, you should be more like Alex Byrd. He said that to me. And after listening to his talk today, I still feel that way. Oh, damn, I should have listened. I never quite. But it just reminds me kind of how, anything we do, anything we are, anything we achieve is embedded in a much larger history. And so I guess I'll conclude by saying that I learned to do history by recognizing that I was, in fact, embedded in history, that history was all around me. And that only by recognizing myself as a historical person and learning how all of those things mattered was I truly able to learn how to do history. For that, I thank Julius Scott for showing, not only that history comes from below, that everybody matters, but that history is also all around. And so I think that forever, when people think about you and your work, they will say, "Thou hast left behind powers."
great to be here and see so many of you. It's great to see you. And I was telling Julius last night, it was every laptop computer that I've had since the beginning of laptops has a copy of Common Wind on it. And I still have all my laptops. I'm just that guy. I'm also from North Carolina too. My peeps are, so I will keep that laptop forever. Make it spare parts. So there's some key words I just want to sort of think about, and as I sort of grapple through this, and I want to think about some time. The key word is thinking in the subjunctive. Thinking and writing in the subjunctive and the conditional. I don't think that you can really understand what Julius taught us and what Julius produced in terms of the Common Wind without an understanding of what the subjunctive does, what work it does, as a form, right? There are ways in which we have to unlearn certain kinds of ways of being a historian, and ways of writing history, and he taught us that, to write and to think in the conditional and the subjunctive. And the other thing is, I am going to be thinking here, another key word is abstraction. That's going to be really critical in what I'm trying to say here, right? That there's a way in which everything that you've heard around the table so far, or today, is really about an abstraction, right? We sort of believe that the moment that we inhabit has always been there, and yet that moment is also part of our fabrication. That as we are producing producing a moment and understanding of the present or the past at this moment, at this present, we also produce an understanding of that past that enables and enhances our own kind of conceit about the present, the past, and the future. So, what follows, right, the anthropologists Sidney Mintz and Richard Price, was written in 1972-73 in the immediate aftermath of the civil rights struggle and the swift establishment of Afro-American and Black studies programs in U.S. universities, part of the veritable explosion of general interest in publications in the sphere of Black history, end quote. In the footnote to this inaugural sentence of this iconic text of creolization studies, that is the birth of African American culture, Mintz and Price cite Peter H. Woods. I did the best I could for my day, the study of early Black history during the Second Reconstruction, 1960 to 1976, calling it, quote, an excellent biographical review of this period. Today, 44 years after the publication of Mintz and Price's self-described provisional statement, which nonetheless became one of the textual foundations for creolization studies, the opening sentence and the footnote speak to the times, the events, and the moment that engendered the new necessity for a Black history and a Black past. The urgency to write and to produce, it also signified that the form and forms that preceded Black history then were not now adequate for the moment and future moments. And what I want to bring to relief here is simply the dearth and flatness. Not complete absence, but the dearth and flatness. And I think that everyone was sort of talking about this in their talks. As it pertained to Black histories or histories of what Julius and others would call Afro-America. And what I want to do here and have us think about is the novelty of the field at the moment many of us up here entered and engaged with Julius's framing of Afro-America, Afro-American history. If I were a little more technically savvy and sophisticated, I would want to do two things here. I would have a PowerPoint, and I would have a picture of a recent chalkboard that I was using in Berlin to teach a course on 18th century Black cultures. And I'm teaching a group of European students, mostly Germans, but also a lot of the fleers from England, young Black students who are leaving England, going to Germany, as well as Eastern European students and Turkish students who are at the university, and they're actually engaged with the question of like Black histories and the study of slavery. And one of the things that's really important to understand is that they too are starting with this moment, and thinking, they're thinking of like the works around the table, and they're thinking that those works already had a foundation in the genealogy. And yet, what's really important is also to bring into relief the fact that work in the 1970s, was really thin. And so I had a list up there of what was being produced, and the only work up there in the colonial South was Peter Wood's book, right? I had the Genoveses, the Blasting Games, you name it. And I think that's really an important kind of point here about the image and the abstraction that I want to get to. So the field was not an established institutional reality, and yet we act now and back then acted as if it was. And from this abstraction, an imagined abstraction, those of here in Julius's orbit pushed and conceived and reconfigured in a manner that speaks to the complexity and expansiveness that is Julius's vision. Let me stress, there was a naiveness and an unawareness and an indifference to actually walk into a graduate program to do what we did and not really be tuned in to the particular entrapment or representational grooves of institutional past, right? It was a conceit, a kind of swaggerliciousness of walking in and actually believing that you could go and do something, and yet the framework, the groove was there, and we all should have like done the things that we came here. 19th century Black women's history, you name it. All of us had a particular kind of groove, and we were licensed, we were and we were indifferent because good teaching does that. It unleashes possibilities.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of what you allowed for us to do in the companionship, and I like the way that you just said that, Vince, in the companionship with all the scholars who were doing this amazing work around the Social History Project. It was naive, unaware, and indifferent to actually walk into a graduate program. And that also meant Duke's institutional past, North Carolina's institutional past, America's institutional past, and that of Afro-America's, which explains how and why we produced what we did and also how we got through. We were indifferent towards it, right? So when we walked in here, and again, you had Alex, I had Julius, because they were like, why can't you be like Julius? Because I arrived here in 1986, the year that dissertation was done, and I'm like, I can't do that. but we still did what we needed to do. So here now, and in relationship to an incredible generative environment that engendered our work, the work of scholars assembled here and those of various classmates, by my loose tabulation, sort of anywhere from 5 to 10 cohorts, we have and can be excused for losing perspective on how novel that moment was. And that the abstraction, that there was a there of Black history, Atlantic history, Black Atlantic history, Afro-American history, or Afro-Atlantic history, simply did not exist systematically in its depth, density, subtlety, or sophistication when Julius wrote his dissertation, taught and engaged us here at Duke. You and we simply cannot appreciate the transformational nature of Julius's Common Wind or of his intellectual impact without understanding that dearth that prevailed and the epistemic confinement that linked nation and narration. The idea that someone could actually write books and conceive of writing books and teaching and imagining the world that wasn't sort of confined and configured by the nation state, right? That was not even on the table fully in the 80s, early 90s. So everything about the Common Wind, but also his teaching, engagement with us as thinkers, and formation was to push at the limits. The dissertation and now a book that easily defined the nation and its boundaries, like the subjects of that history who previous scholars could glimpse but not place in the nation-bound paradigms. And then to press us to imagine, to conceptualize, and if not theorize at the limits. Mintz and Price in our conversations was central. but Julius understood their ideas as provisional, which they announced in that text, which explains his exasperation that we, their acolytes of Mintz and Price and disciples, simply absorbed creolization rather than thinking that the concept and phenomenon was historical, not merely African versus Creole, but historical. But that creolization was not simply a static generational phenomenon, but an experience defining the historicity that we imposed, which had deep and profound implications for how we needed to conceptualize and imagine Black lives and histories. To this day, I'm still trying to figure out how to write such a cultural history of Blackness. An idea that Julius simply put out there one night at a bar, Mal's upstairs, during the warm-up of a Duke basketball game. Thank you.
In my 5 minutes here, I just want to make 2 points, and the first one is really blindingly obvious, but I think is worth stating nonetheless, and that is that Julius introduced me and the rest of us at Duke in the early 90s to this tremendously rich and expansive view of the Atlantic world, of the urban underground, and of the masterless Caribbean. And that all sounds obvious to us today, but this was 30 years ago. And I remember in the mid-90s, Bernard Bailyn wrote this little essay, which he later expanded into a book called The Idea of Atlantic History, in which he sketched out the origin of this field. He said it arose after World War II, and when there was this recognition of these shared transatlantic values between the United States and Europe, and he connected it to NATO, and so on and so on. And this just blew my mind. I was like, I never heard, like, this is a parallel universe. There is this Atlantic world. So, thanks to Dr. Scott, in the first day in our seminar on the Afro-Atlantic, he wrote these 2 numbers on the board, 2 million and 3.7 million. It was the number 2 million Europeans who crossed the Atlantic before 1760, and 3.7 million Africans. 18 Africans for every 10 Europeans. And that was the beginning point, this such a simple fact, but so profound that we built, provided the foundation for the rest of the seminar. So, reading that Bailyn essay, I'm going to use a musical comparison because one of the things that Dr. Scott and I share is a love of jazz. But when I read that essay, I was like, wow, I've been at Duke studying with Duke Ellington for 4 years, and it just dawned on me that a lot of grad students in the Northeast were still studying and listening to Paul Whiteman. For those of you who don't know Paul Whiteman, the name says it all. So, that's the first point.
Because I can't listen to Fishbone. That was my problem.
That's the first point I wanted to make. But the second one is that Dr. Scott does not abide in speculation. He is, despite the fact that he was on the vanguard of this field and showing us the way, he is at the same time kind of resolutely old school. So the first day he wrote those population figures on the board, and then the second class meeting, he gave us a map quiz. And we were Duke grad students, so that caused a mini scandal, because we're too good. We don't really need to know where these islands are. We just want to talk about but Dr. Scott insisted, if you need to know where Martinique is. So he passed out a map of the Caribbean without labels and had us label all of the islands, and it didn't go well for us. One other quick example of this, which has stuck with me for 30 years, oddly. It had such a profound impact on me. I was so surprised. he was teaching an undergraduate course on the American Revolution, and I sat in on a few of those lectures just to get my feet on the ground. So one day I went in there, and he launched into this lecture on, it was absolutely gripping lecture on the Two-Penny Act and the Parsons Cause of 1758 in colonial Virginia. And I was just astounded, one, that anyone could make this sound interesting. I mean, this is as old school as it can get. But he, as you probably gathered, those of you who don't know him personally, you probably gathered in the first half of today's session, he's a great storyteller. But he basically went to town on this story. The undergraduates were gripped. And I just came away thinking, like, yeah, you need to go back to the musical comparison. If you want to play like Lee Morgan, you're also going to have to learn how to play like Harry James. Dr. Scott could do both sides of that. I think this is also these qualities, this old school quality, and this yet being on the vanguard of this field is also evident in his book. And I'll conclude with just a reference to one of my favorite passages in the book. It's right at the end of the chapter on Pandora's Box, and Dr. Scott is illustrating the urban underground in the Caribbean, and he doesn't speculate about it. He doesn't kind of sketch it in general or vague terms. He just gives us a incredibly concrete, tangible, wonderfully engaging story to illustrate the existence of the urban underground. So he tells this story, some of you will remember it, of the British regimental musicians who abscond in 1793. There are 10 of them in all. They make up a full band. There's a clarinetist and an Irish drummer, as I recall. They run away. They end up hiding out in the house of a black woman. Some of them are captured. 2 of them eventually end up in the company of a black fiddle player named Jack Naylor, who lives somewhere near the Jew market in Spanish Town. So, it's just this kind of beautifully concrete example of this world that is so hard for us to recover, and he was able to do it without speculating, but just by showing us. So the book was written over 30 years ago, but it remains a model of scholarship for us all.
So I have spent the past few days, few weeks, trying to figure out how to characterize a particular feeling. And that feeling is the retrospective recognition that things that appeared to be entirely normal, regular, or widely understood to be the case were in fact revolutionarily, uniquely, and groundbreakingly new. And I can't figure out what the word for that is, but maybe the word is common wind. I had only been a graduate student for a few weeks when I read Julius Scott's Common Wind for Bill Reddy's historical methods class. We had to read a dissertation of somebody who had gone through the Duke Ph.D. program so that we understood what a dissertation was supposed to look like. I came to Duke in 1988, the same year that Professor Scott returned to his alma mater as a faculty member, and I chose this particular dissertation because I was obviously stalking him. I didn't know much at that point, but I knew that I wanted to figure out how this young black professor's brain worked. I had no idea at the time that framing a study on the basis of webs and ideas and actions that connected people across categories of race, of freedom, of region, of language, and of occupation was anything unusual. This department had admitted me despite the fact that I'd only taken 2 undergraduate history courses. So I knew nothing about how to write history or really what history was. So Common Wind felt like it was just regular history. Like, oh, this is how you write history. I didn't understand what was going to be its status as an underground mixtape, which I will never not call it that, even as I too passed around my copy, and by the way, taught it every year from 1997 on. So I had nothing to compare it to. It was only over time that I came to understand the multiplicity of interventions that it made and the colossal research project that was the foundation for such interventions. From the onset, it's clear that Scott was pressing firmly against the national boundaries that had always defined the history of slavery, colonialism, and colonial subjects. In one regard, the focus on islands and the sea, particularly on sailors, makes such an approach natural, but it must be emphasized again that doing so, as we've all said today, required an interpretive and methodological breadth that makes the Common Wind not just an invaluable study, but the foundation for the structural turn that our field has taken in its aftermath. As the reader moves from Cuba to Jamaica to Saint Domingue to Virginia to New York to Carolina, Scott's examination of commercial networks and the inability and unwillingness of colonial officials to control or curb either the legal or illegal exchanges of goods across empires causes the logic of framing the study through the Atlantic to come into focus. These commercial networks and exchanges were, of course, entirely legible to scholars of trade, commerce, and war, but their consequence for the material, cultural, political, and individual lives of servants and slaves, of sailors and higglers, of runaways and revolutionaries was not. What Common Wind does is illuminate the extent to which the commercial and military networks of the Caribbean were crucial both to the development of individual colonial states and to the conceptual parameters of Black freedom. Those who moved in tandem with the expanding commercial networks in the Caribbean were indeed actors, and that's what Julius taught us, was that these were people whose lives and ideas mattered. They walked through port cities, they exchanged goods and information with each other, they boarded ships voluntarily and involuntarily, and witnessed their counterparts in other ports doing the same. They married, were arrested, were kidnapped, ran to join maroon communities alone and in groups. They crafted an ideology of freedom in the face of slavery and coercion. They posed a tangible source of danger to colonial officials who repeatedly and unsuccessfully attempted to argue that they had no capacity to do so. This is an Atlantic world. This is an Atlantic world in which the porous boundaries that demarcated the imperial ambitions of Europe are evidence not only of those empires' capitalist and regional ambitions, but also the extent to which masterless people, men and women, as I've said to Julius before, proved the lie of mercantilist tenets. This is an Atlantic that is lyrical and material, where runaways and rogues, quote, orient themselves towards the sea and the world beyond the horizon, close quote. And when they do so, they make manifest their ability to expand both their material and their ideological impact on the region. This is the era of revolutions, yes. This is the impact of Black people on the region. This is the Black Atlantic. But there's no Atlantic in the index of the book. No explicit use of the term in this work. No explicit use of the term, I think, I may be wrong, that this work inaugurates. There are currents and winds, there are masterless men and rumors, and we recognize through Common Wind that obtaining, manipulating, and transmitting information, despite colonial authorities' efforts to hinder them, brought Black, brown, white men and women into contact in a marketplace of ideas that was not bounded by shorelines or empires, in which the power of the slave owner and the slave owning state was not absolute, and in which affinities and antagonisms existed among and across lines of race, states of unfreedom, and of occupation. Scott beautifully shows that this Atlantic produces a history of Black people, not a history of Black people alone, but a history that centers the productive and painful ways in which hereditary racial slavery was produced in the currents of the Atlantic. And the work clarifies that we cannot fully comprehend those histories without centering Black people and people of African descent. It is a model of social history. Scott's commitment to ensuring that the men and women who people the Caribbean and North American colonies are the prism through which we understand that area is what makes it most important here. Common Wind is the model, of what Atlantic history ought to be. And I think that's the problem for us who work in this area. Well, it's the problem because we can't ever do it quite the way that you did it. But it's also the problem that is, as Herman said, the incompleteness of understanding the connection between writing history and national projects. So thinking outside of those national projects is so brilliant, and it is the result of such a tenacious researcher and an important thinker. I wanted to just say a little bit about the book, right? But let me end, but I have a little bit of time, by talking about Julius's commitments as a teacher. So when I arrived at Duke, I had some nonsensical plan to study 20th century social movements. And then came Common Wind and Professor Scott and the notion of the Atlantic world and Professor Scott's refusal to allow categories of race to serve as shorthands for things we claimed to already know. That refusal was at the core of his impact on me as a teacher. Julius was exacting. He was not easy. I think we all know that. Julius would hand a paper back to you covered with comments and expect a new version shortly. Julius scared me a bit. I wanted more than anything to make him know that I had listened. He was my advisor in ways that exceeded my time at Duke and his. A few years ago, I gave a talk at Michigan. Julius was there, sitting quietly and listening without a notebook. We went for coffee afterwards, and he said he had a few comments for me. With no notes, we sat there at a coffee shop in Ann Arbor for more than 2 hours as he gave me some of the most important feedback on my project that I've ever gotten. And I hope, Julius, that you will be able to recognize your impact on the final version, because I certainly do. Nothing about the way in which I approach my work could have happened without the contributions of Professor Scott. Common Wind laid the foundation for a field in which there has been radical, undeniable, fundamental change in the past 25 years. A cursory glance at the work published in the William and Mary Quarterly or at the Institute for Early American History and Culture series at UNC Press tells you that our approach to the early modern world and to what constitutes political and social history has been transformed by the intervention of Julius Scott's work on the page and in the classroom. Scott's work makes my work, and Ada Ferrer and Aisha Finch and Laurent Dubois and Greg O'Malley and Alex Barucki and Natasha Lightfoot and Sasha Turner's and so many others' work possible. More specifically, the community of scholars with whom I studied at Duke in the late 80s and 90s are rooted in the orbit of Julius's considerable influence. Those of us on this panel represent two things: students who work outside of the direct field associated with the influence of Common Wind, but who benefited from Julius's exacting and expansive teaching and who went on to work in other fields. And those who call ourselves Atlanticists, who have made, if I may, significant contributions to the history of the Black Atlantic, all of whom we are actively training students who themselves are working in this field, and all of whom have been teaching Common Wind for decades. How grateful we are to now have this book in hardcovers, how grateful we are to be able to firmly root our own interventions in the influence and work of Professor Scott. And if I may speak for all of us here, it is an honor to be able to acknowledge this debt today. Thank you.
It's been probably 20 years since I've been here in Durham, and I've always considered Durham and Duke to be really homes of my own. And even while enjoying myself teaching at other places like New York University and the University of Michigan, I always looked back with a special wistfulness at the years I taught here at Duke. And the students that I was privileged, as you've seen a little wistful answer of that today to the kinds of students that I felt very privileged to be able to work with, interact with, teach something, learn something from, and I just had a really wonderful time. Trying to keep up with these kids wasn't easy, but you know, I managed to struggle. At the end of the day, I'd be, got another day tomorrow to deal with these kids. But no, you all were really the salt of my life for many years. And I'm so glad to see so many of you have become so gratefully important and successful in the profession that you've taken up here. And that I had something to do with this, I can just be really proud of and take some credit for it, even though I shouldn't. You all really did a great job in classes like Origins of the Black Atlantic and Origins of Afro-America, and gave a certain real meaning to that experience that I felt was always true and that was always present. And I hope you all understand. And I'm grateful for all of the great things that you all have said to me today. And I'll you know, when I get alone tonight with the lights off, I'll remember it. I'll remember them. But I just want you to understand that you all had a lot to do with the ways in which my success was being measured, and that success could not have been measured without having you, all the way from, you know, teaching Alex Byrd as a freshman, all the way to teaching you know, third and fourth year graduate students. Once I got to Duke and to Michigan. Thank you so much, both for the success of this project, The Common Wind, but also for the ways in which you all helped me to really understand and appreciate the kinds of things that I was contributing to you and that you to me. We had a ball for a while. No, we really did. We did a good job. Every time we had class, there was some new thing going on. And really, I wasn't just imagining this. This was true. I think you all enjoyed taking these classes. I enjoyed teaching them. Thank you so much for you all for helping me to bring these things forward. I really did have a great time while I was here, and look back on it again very wistfully and with a lot of great memories. And again, I'm really glad to see and get reminded by the great success and the great importance that students from Duke have contributed to the larger profession of Atlantic history, and the fact that, you know, Peter and I and Barry and Ray and others who were here had some input to that. I think we're all we remain all very proud of that input and of the way that you all have really moved on and moved outward. I'm very happy to be here and very happy to be a part of this world. You know, and I have to say, can we talk for a second here? I really don't I've been very surprised at how, and I'm not just being modest about this. I'm not modest. I'm right. But I've been really surprised at, and this has a lot to do with you all too. I've been really surprised at how successful the Common Wind has been, picking up these, various trade publications and seeing my book being reviewed in it with all kinds of great and wonderful things associated with it. How good the writing is, how good the thinking is, all these things that people had to say, and they were saying those things about us, not just about me. They were saying those things about all of us, and about all of the things that you helped to contribute to this. And really, thank you so much for making this a very, very joyful part of my life. Hear that we're now moving toward the latter stages of my no more teaching, and it's something that I miss a lot. But part of the reason that I miss it is because I miss the impacts that you all continue to have on me, and hopefully will continue to have on me. Thanks so much.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.